Welcome to the deep dive, where we kind of take those sources you're curious about and, you know, really pull out the insights you actually need.
Yeah, it's like imagine becoming seriously knowledgeable without like spending hours and hours.
Exactly. We aim for fast, thorough, and hopefully a few aha moments along the way. No one wants to feel overwhelmed by information, right?
Right. And speaking of avoiding information overload, today's deep dive is perfect for those who want to learn efficiently. Love those light bulb moments.
Absolutely. And you, dear listener, are exactly who we're thinking of today.
Today we're diving into Eric Ries, The Lean Startup, how today's entrepreneurs use continuous innovation to create radically successful businesses.
This book, it's not just sitting on a shelf somewhere.
No, no, not at all. It's a foundational text, really. I mean, we're talking endorsements from some heavy hitters. Tim Brown, CEO of IDEO.
Oh, yeah, and Steve Blank from Stanford and UC Berkeley, right?
Yeah, him too. And Scott Case, Startup America Partnership.
Wow. They're all in on this.
Eugene J. Huang, he's from True North Venture Partner, and he called it a must-read for entrepreneurs who are truly ready to start something great.
So what's our mission today? Well, we're going to unpack the core of the lean startup methodology, really understand why it's so influential in innovation.
Whether you're launching your own venture, or trying to drive change in a big company, these ideas matter.
Big time. So Rees, he starts by talking about a problem that a lot of us have probably faced.
Yeah, that feeling of pouring your heart and soul into something only for it to totally flop in the market.
Oof, yeah. He even calls out this allure we have for a good plan, a solid strategy, and really thorough market research.
And on the surface, that sounds right, doesn't it?
Of course. Do your homework, plan everything out, success should follow. But Rees makes a really strong argument that for startups, that approach, well, it often falls flat.
Especially because startups, they operate in this constant uncertainty.
Yeah, who are your customers? What do they actually want? Even what your product truly is. That's where those traditional plans tend to break down.
And it's not just about avoiding failure. It's about avoiding this thing Rees calls achieving failure.
Achieving failure. What's that?
Basically, it's perfectly executing a plan, even a complex one, that was flawed from the get-go.
I see. So, like, imagine companies that invest tons of money in forecasting huge customer adoption rates.
And then those numbers just never happen. They followed the plan to a T, but the underlying assumptions were just wrong.
So how does the lean startup help us steer clear of those pitfalls?
Vice talks about driving a startup. Instead of a fixed plan, you're constantly adjusting, using what he calls the build, measure, learn feedback loop.
So it's almost like having a really sensitive steering wheel, making constant adjustments based on real-world data, right?
Exactly. And you're deciding, should I stick with this course or do I need to make a big change, a pivot?
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the book might be called The Lean Startup, but Rees actually has a pretty broad definition of who an entrepreneur is.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about being in a garage in Silicon Valley.
Right. He says an entrepreneur is anyone who works within my definition of a startup, a human institution designed to create new products and services under conditions of extreme uncertainty.
So entrepreneurs, they can be anywhere.
In any kind of organization, big or small, old or new. He even talks about Mark, a general manager in a large company.
This guy had a team, a vision, and he was willing to take risks like a true entrepreneur.
But he didn't have that process, that methodology for turning those ideas into wins within a big company.
Right. It's like having the ingredients but no recipe.
Then there's that cool story about SnapTax at Intuit, a company that seems pretty traditional. They make financial software.
But they managed to launch this super innovative product, a way to do your taxes right on your phone.
So entrepreneurship isn't limited to just new companies. It can thrive inside big ones, too. They call those folks intrapreneurs.
Right. And Scott Cook, Intuit's founder, he even realized their old management style. It just wasn't working for this kind of innovation.
So it's not just about that initial spark of an idea. It's about managing that journey, bringing the idea to life in the face of all that uncertainty.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the 5 principles of the lean startup that Rees outlines. These are like the foundation of everything.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, like we just talked about, entrepreneurs are everywhere. It's not just about tech startups. It's a mindset, a set of practices for anyone, anywhere.
Got it. What's number 2?
Principle number 2 is that entrepreneurship is management. A startup, it's not just a product. It's an institution that needs a new type of management, one that's built for growth in unpredictable environments.
So you can't just have a great idea. You have to manage the entire process, the development, the launch, everything.
Exactly. Now, principle number 3 is validated learning. This is huge. Reese says a startup's main goal isn't just to build something or even make money right away.
It's to learn how to build a sustainable business, right?
Yes. And not just based on gut feelings or opinions, but through real experiments that test every assumption you have.
So not just gathering data, but really testing those fundamental beliefs you have about your customer and your business model, which, let's be honest, are often totally wrong.
Often, yeah. And that leads us to principle 4, build, measure, learn. This is that feedback loop we mentioned earlier.
So you take an idea, build a version of it, even a very basic one, then you measure how customers react to it, and you learn from that data whether to change course or keep going.
Right. It's all about speeding up that learning and adaptation process.
And finally, principle number 5, innovation accounting.
This was about bringing some rigor to the process. How do we measure progress, set milestones, and prioritize work in a way that makes sense for startups?
Because, let's face it, traditional financial accounting doesn't really fit the startup world, right?
Not really. It relies on these long-term forecasts and rigid milestones that just don't work when everything is constantly changing.
Okay, so those 5 principles provide the framework. Let's dig into one of the most important parts, validated learning, and actually seeing that build, measure, learn loop in action.
Sure. So Rees argues that a startup's real mission is figuring out what actually creates value for their potential customers.
Right. And he uses the story of IMVU, a company he co-founded. They thought people would love this instant messaging add-on with 3D avatars.
They spent a lot of time making it technically awesome, but what happened?
Well, not much. Customers just weren't using it the way they expected. Another classic example of building something based on assumptions that just weren't true.
And the dangerous thing about these vanity metrics, it's not just that they look good on paper, it's that they can trick you into thinking you're on the right track when you're actually not.
You keep pouring time and resources into something that's not working.
Yeah. What's interesting is what IMVU learned from this. They realized people didn't want an add-on. They wanted a whole new instant messaging network.
And they also found out that people weren't actually scared of learning a new IM platform or inviting their friends. In fact, people wanted to make new connections, which the avatar technology was great for.
Exactly. So instead of just asking people what they want, which Rees warns against because people often don't know what they'll want in the future, you need to make hypotheses and test them.
Right. So IMVU started doing these targeted experiments. Like they changed the wording on their website from avatar chat to 3D instant messaging and tracked which one got more signups and, importantly, more long-term paying users.
That's validated learning in a nutshell, using real customer behavior to tell you if your assumptions are right or wrong.
And it wasn't just about the product itself. Reese talks about Zappos, the online shoe store. Their early experiment was incredibly simple.
They didn't even have any shoes in stock.
They took pictures of shoes in local stores, put them online, and if someone ordered, they'd go buy the shoes.
Talk about a lean operation.
They were testing the big question. Do people actually want to buy shoes online? But they were also testing things like customer interaction, payments, logistics, the whole works.
Right. It was real-world data. People either bought shoes online or they didn't. Plus, they got to interact directly with those early customers, learning tons from their feedback.
And think of the MVP as tackling that riskiest assumption you have. What's the smallest experiment you can do to see if it holds up?
Exactly. He even talks about Caroline's volunteer campaign at HP, showing how these principles work, even in a big company.
They were facing uncertainty about employee motivation. Would this volunteer program even spread? So they did small pilot experiments with a limited group.
If those didn't work, it'd be a clear sign to rethink their strategy, to pivot.
Okay, so we've got the principles, we've got validated learning. Now let's talk about the minimum viable product, or MVP. This is a direct result of that build, measure, learn loop.
It is. So how does Rees define it?
He calls it the fastest, most efficient way to get through that build, measure, learn cycle. The goal is to test those critical business assumptions quickly and cheaply.
Think about the early days of Groupon. It wasn't this fancy e-commerce platform. It started with, like, handmade PDFs and a simple blog.
Just testing the core concept of those group discounts, a perfect example of an MVP stripped down, ready to learn from.
He also talks about these concierge MVPs.
Oh yeah, where you actually provide the service manually just to test those growth model assumptions.
Right. Even if it's not scalable or profitable right away, like those early experiments with the Internet Button Company or a Hardvark, You get amazing insights into what customers really value.
It really challenges our idea of what quality means, right? Because some incredibly successful products started out, well, pretty rough around the edges.
Yeah, think about early Craigslist or even Groupon again. It wasn't about perfection. It was about learning.
Hmm.
Like IMVU's teleporting avatars.
Those were low quality, but they were a quick way to see if users even cared about having their avatars move around.
Right. And, a lot of entrepreneurs worry that releasing an MVP means someone's going to steal their idea.
But Rees actually argues that getting noticed is harder than most people think.
Yeah, and the real advantage is in executing quickly and constantly learning, which is where the lean startup shines.
So you've got your MVP out there. You're gathering data through that build, measure, learn loop. How do you know if you're actually making progress?
Ah, that's where innovation accounting comes in. Because standard accounting, with its spreadsheets and forecasts, it's not really built for the uncertainty of a startup.
Right. Rees says those traditional methods aren't helpful for evaluating startup progress because, well, startups are unpredictable by nature.
Exactly. Innovation accounting focuses on these learning milestones. You use your MVPs to get that baseline data for key metrics.
Like customer acquisition cost, churn rate, customer lifetime value, those kinds of things.
Right. And he compares two types of startups. One that defines metrics and hypotheses, runs experiments to test them.
Versus one that just kind of makes changes based on gut feeling without measuring anything.
Yeah, it's pretty clear which one is going to be more successful. It's about being scientific in your approach to progress.
And that data helps you make that pivot or persevere decision. You look at whether your experiments are actually moving those key metrics in the right direction.
If they're not, if you're seeing flatlining or negative trends, it might be time for a change.
He also warns about those vanity metrics, the numbers that look good but don't actually reflect real progress.
Like Grokit, early on, they focused on total users and total questions answered.
But those numbers were going up and the business wasn't necessarily healthier.
Exactly. The solution is to use actionable metrics.
So those are metrics that are easy to understand. They're expressed in tangible units like actual paying customers, not just website hits.
Right. And you have to be able to trust the data. Plus, they have to show you how specific actions are influencing customer behavior, the cause and effect.
Like Grokit testing their simplified, lazy registration versus the full registration.
They thought making it easier to sign up would bring in tons of new users, but
But their experiments showed that their marketing and the product itself were much more important.
when your data, your actionable metrics, tell you you're on the wrong track, that's when you need to pivot.
Now, a pivot isn't just changing things randomly. It's a structured change based on what you've learned to test a new fundamental hypothesis about your product, your target customer, or even how you grow.
Rees uses the example of David Benetti's company, Vodafone. They pivoted multiple times.
They went from a social network to a transactional model and then finally to a platform.
And what's interesting is that each time they pivoted, they actually got faster at developing and testing MVPs.
Because they were building on all that knowledge from previous iterations.
Exactly. And he points out that even successful companies need to be ready to pivot.
They can't just rely on their past wins. Like Wealthfront, they started as an online game for investors called Kaching.
And eventually, they pivoted into the wealth management platform they are today.
It's all about adapting and learning, even when you're already successful.
So to keep that build, measure, learn loop going quickly, Rees stresses the importance of batch size and continuous deployment. He actually borrows some ideas from lean manufacturing.
Oh, interesting. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. He uses this example of stuffing newsletters. You might think it's faster to do each task and bulk fold all the newsletters, then seal all the envelopes and so on.
Yeah, that seems more efficient.
But actually doing one complete newsletter at a time is faster, and you make fewer mistakes.
That's counterintuitive.
It is. But think about Toyota. After World War II, they had a smaller market and limited resources,
So they embraced small batch production using more flexible machinery,
which let them make a wider range of cars and find and fix quality issues much faster.
like their famous and Fandon cord system where any worker could stop the whole production line if they saw a problem.
Right, and this translates really well to software development through continuous deployment.
So it's like creating an immune system for your code.
Exactly. You find and remove defects immediately, the team is alerted, and no more changes go through until you fix the root cause.
And Wealthfront, even though they're in a heavily regulated industry, they do multiple software releases every single day.
Impressive. Rees also talks about SGW, a company that designs military gear. They use rapid prototyping, things like 3D CAD and CNC machining.
And they can get a working prototype to their clients in just 3 days.
Amazing. That kind of speed wouldn't be possible with those old, large batch processes.
And then there's School of One. They use personalized learning so they can try out curriculum changes in small batches and see the impact on individual students almost immediately.
That's so cool. The real danger is what Rees calls the large batch death spiral.
Where trying to be efficient by working in big isolated batches actually leads to delays, rework, and less overall productivity.
Because you don't catch problems early on. He emphasizes that in a lean startup, it's the validated customer needs that pull the work through the system.
Not some preset plan.
Right. Like Alphabet Energy, they make these innovative thermoelectric materials.
And they use existing manufacturing infrastructure and focus on early customer feedback through small deployments to constantly check if their product is actually valuable.
It's all about rapid learning and adaptation through those small, frequent iterations.
Okay, so you've built something people want. Now, how do you grow sustainably? Ruiz has a very specific definition for that.
He says sustainable growth is when new customers come from the actions of past customers.
So it's not about relying on those one-off marketing blitzes. It's about building a system where your current users are bringing in new ones.
And he talks about 3 engines of growth that startups use.
Okay, let's hear them.
The first one is the sticky engine of growth.
Mm.
This is all about keeping your customers and making your products so engaging they stick around.
So the key metric here is minimizing churn, right? Making sure people don't leave.
Exactly. Like Pointcast, they were good at getting new users back in the .com days, but people weren't sticking around because the product wasn't sticky enough.
What's the next engine?
The viral engine of growth. This is all about your users spreading the word for you.
Like that viral loop, how many new customers does each existing customer bring in?
Right. Think about Hotmail with that little link in every email, or those classic Tupperware parties.
If that viral coefficient stays above 1.0, you've got the potential for explosive growth.
And then there's the paid engine of growth, where you use paid marketing to get new customers.
Like online ads or even a sales team.
Right. The important thing here is making sure your customer lifetime value, or LTV, is way higher than your cost per acquisition, or CPA.
Because if it's not, you're just burning money.
Exactly. Rashri says successful startups usually focus on one engine of growth at a time instead of trying to do all 3 at once.
Because that can spread you too thin.
Right. And understanding your main engine of growth helps you define what product market fit really means for you and which metrics to track.
Now, even with the best plans, problems are going to pop up. That's where being able to adapt and learn from mistakes is so important.
Absolutely. And Rees introduces this technique called the 5 whys to help you get to the root of those problems.
It's surprisingly simple, but powerful. When something goes wrong, you keep asking why, usually 5 times, to dig down to the real cause.
Like that famous example Ono gives about the broken machine, it starts with a blown fuse, but by asking why 5 times.
They eventually figure out it was because someone didn't attach a strainer properly.
Right. And Rees points out that even problems that seem purely technical often have a human element at their core.
Like a lack of training, a bad process, or even just someone having the wrong idea about something.
Like at IMVU, customer complaints eventually led them to realize their engineers weren't trained well enough because a manager had the wrong idea about their skills.
So once you find the root cause, you need to invest in fixing it proportionally.
Right. You don't want to overreact to little symptoms, but you also need to address those deeper, more impactful causes.
It ties your progress to actual learning and understanding, not just to doing things.
Rees gives some good advice for using the 5 whys. Keep it simple, have someone facilitate the questions, and make sure everyone involved in the problem is part of the process.
Like that IGN blog outage example. They use the 5 whys to trace a technical error all the way back to problems with their software deployment and even how the team communicated.
And he tells that story about the QuickBooks team, led by Greg, who managed to overcome the limitations of the traditional waterfall development process.
By using smaller batches, new tech like virtualization, and actually bringing customers into the development process through these idea code solution jams.
Talk about continuous improvement. Rees also emphasizes that even big, successful companies need to embrace the lean startup to stay ahead of the curve.
They can't just rest on their laurels.
Right. They need to create these innovation sandboxes, protected environments where teams can experiment quickly without being bogged down by bureaucracy.
And as those internal startups grow, Companies need to manage different types of work, scaling those successful innovations, getting them adopted by the mainstream, dealing with competitors, and at the same time, supporting those brand new, potentially disruptive ideas.
That's a lot to juggle.
It is. And he also talks about the challenges of bringing those successful sandbox projects back into the main company and keeping that lean startup culture alive as the company grows.
So it's about always questioning, always experimenting for every new initiative.
In his final thoughts, Rees reflects on the bigger picture, connecting the lean startup to the history of scientific management and those revolutions in productivity.
He highlights this crucial shift from just being efficient at making things to knowing what to build in the first place, especially in today's world where everything is changing so fast.
And he talks about the waste of human creativity and potential when products fail and projects go nowhere.
It's a powerful point. He also warns against just blindly applying the lean startup without a solid foundation in scientific thinking.
And he even proposes creating startup testing labs to really research and compare different product development methods.
Like a scientific approach to figuring out what works best.
He also mentions this idea of a long-term stock exchange designed to support companies that are focused on long-term value, not just quick profits.
So for you, our learner, here are the key takeaways from our deep dive into the lean startup.
It's a framework for dealing with the uncertainty of innovation. It's about validated learning through experiments, that build, measure, learn loop.
It's about starting with an MVP to test your big assumptions and using those actionable metrics to understand your progress.
And it's about being adaptable, knowing when to pivot based on the evidence, and understanding the different ways your venture can grow sustainably.
And remember, these principles aren't just for brand new companies.
They work just as well for driving innovation and change within established organizations, big or small.
Absolutely.
So here's a final thought for you to ponder. Think about a challenge you're facing right now, at work, in your personal life, anywhere.
How could you use validated learning to tackle that challenge?
What's one big assumption you're making that you could test with a small, simple experiment?
Thank you for choosing the Lean Startup for our deep dive. We hope you've learned a lot and had a few of those aha moments.
And let us know what other fascinating topics you'd like us to explore in future deep dives.
We're always up for a good challenge.
Until next time.
Happy innovating.